This video is a compilation of our lessons about all 6 chess pieces. Please listen through to the end to get the most out of the lessons.
Pawns. This is going to be a rather long lesson, as well as a tough one, since pawns are by far the most misunderstood piece on the board, and contrary to popular belief, one of the most complex pieces as well, simply due to the extensive considerations and possible situations that can result from their correct or incorrect use. First off, however, tell me something. How often have you heard someone talk about a person as a mere pawn? Someone or something that was completely disposable and without any real value. Oh, that's just a pawn. Well, in chess, that is totally wrong when referring to a pawn. The fact is that pawns, while by far the weakest piece force-wise, are so important that they are actually referenced as one of the 4 basic elements of chess. The 4 elements of chess will be discussed in greater detail in later lessons. I will also introduce exercises to better develop your use and understanding of pawns. While they are often considered completely unimportant by lower-rated players, the pawn is actually an extremely important part of the game. Your entire game absolutely revolves around the proper placement of your pawns. Think of your pawns like your battlements in a war, the walls of your castle, your defensive barrier or fortress against your opponent's onslaught. Designed correctly, a fortress should allow you freedom of movement through it, so you can maneuver in and out at will, while simultaneously holding your opponent at bay. Lay out your defenses wrong, and the opposite may occur, making it actually more difficult for yourself to maneuver, and unfortunately easier for your enemy to penetrate. The very famous old Grandmaster Philidor of the 1800s once stated, "Play the pawns well. They are the soul of chess. It is they which uniquely determine the attack and the defense, and on their good or bad arrangement depends entirely the winning or losing of the game." If anyone ever says to you that pawns are simply not important, or scoffs at the very concept that they may be, just smile and teach that person, through your own mastery of their use, the error of their ways. So let's begin with their basic movements. Pawns always move straight forward up a file. They are not allowed to move backwards, actually being the only piece of the game that cannot move backwards. On its very first move, a pawn may move either 1 or 2 squares. Once it has been moved, however, it is forever limited to moving only a single square at a time. Any piece that is in front of a pawn halts its progress cold. Pawns cannot capture forward, so any piece, either your own or your opponent's, stops their movement in a forward direction. Pawns can threaten or capture an opponent's piece only on a forward diagonal to either side. Any opponent's piece that is on one of the 4 diagonal squares may be taken by a pawn. Pawn structure. Your pawn structure is the layout or configuration of all of your pawns. Since pawns are the least mobile of the chess pieces, the pawn structure is relatively static, and thus correct initial configuration of your overall pawn structure largely determines the strategic nature of the game's position thereafter. You should strive to create a solid but flexible pawn structure that works best for you as well as inhibits your opponent. Aspects of a pawn structure include pawn chains. A pawn chain is a sequence of pawns on adjacent files that all protect one another. The base pawn is often referred to as a backward pawn, and usually must be defended by a piece. A piece being defined in chess as any piece other than a pawn. This reduces the piece's ability to perform other duties. If the base of a pawn chain falls, it is actually possible to lose the entire pawn chain. Pawn islands. A pawn island is defined as any contiguous group of pawns separated by a file lacking a pawn of your own color. The more pawn islands you have, the weaker the overall solidity of your structure becomes, and the greater the likelihood of more base pawns, which in turn requires the dedication of more pieces to the protection of those pawn islands. Doubled pawns. When two pawns are moved onto the same file, the lead pawn actually prohibits the movement of the pawn behind it. This formation is referred to as doubled pawns. Due to this, the rearmost pawn, in chess theory, actually loses half of its force value. It should be noted that doubled pawns are only considered bad by more experienced players when they occur on a file other than the D and the E file. On the center two files, doubled pawns actually can prove beneficial and can usually be resolved later in the game through exchanges. Isolated pawns. A pawn is considered isolated when there are no pawns on the adjacent files that can protect it if required. Such pawns, just like the base of a pawn chain, require the protection of a piece if threatened. If doubled pawns are isolated, they are called double isolated pawns. Stone walls. A stone wall configuration is a formation that totally blockades a section of the board, effectively stopping all passage for either player in that area. A stone wall across the entire board usually is very devastating and often forces a draw. En passant and pawn promotion have been given their own lessons in the next section of Chess Coach. As you can see, pawns are far more complex than they may initially appear, and the general public's understanding of them is that they are unimportant. That is very, very far from the truth. As Philidor noted, they are, in essence, the very soul of chess. Knights. I often refer to the knight with my younger students as the sneaky piece. The knight is often the most difficult piece for newer players to understand, since its method of movement is not as straightforward as all the other chess pieces. The knight moves in an L shape, moving two squares either way horizontally and then one square either way vertically, or moving two squares either way vertically and then one square either way horizontally. The knight can also not be blocked by any other piece, neither by your own or those of your opponent, and therefore it can jump over any piece freely, making it a difficult piece to fend off, and one whose moves are often overlooked by less observant players. It is, of course, not able to move to a square that is occupied by one of your own pieces. If it moves to a square that's occupied by an opponent's piece, it can capture that piece. A knight, like most other pieces, is more powerful and has more scope or space when it resides in the center of the board, the center being defined by this area. When a knight is in this area, it has exactly 8 moves. Now I'm going to pause the video. See if you can identify the 8 squares this knight can move to, and click resume when you wish to continue. Pause. The knight can move to all of these highlighted squares. This is often referred to as the knight's circle. You will see that as the knight gets further and further away from the center area, that its number of possible moves, and therefore its capabilities on the board, diminish. The knight is very powerful as a defender, very powerful as an attacker. It can fork or attack more than one of your opponent's pieces at the same time, and as previously stated, is difficult to fend off if used by a player that has mastered its capabilities. If you become proficient with your knights, your opponents will have a great deal of difficulty whenever they face you. The bishops, like the knights, are referred to as a minor piece. They move any distance along the diagonal as long as they are unimpeded. If they are blocked by one of their own pieces, they cannot go any further in that direction. If they can strike an opponent's piece, they may capture it, taking it off the board and occupying the square where the opponent's piece had been. Like most pieces, the bishops are influenced by the center. Bishops have the most possible moves when closest to the center, progressively having fewer and fewer moves as they approach the edge of the board. Each player's side has 2 bishops, one for each colored square. A bishop can never leave its own color, which therefore limits a bishop to accessing only half, or 32, of all of the board squares. By having one of each color, therefore, you can access all 64 squares. That means that if at all possible, you should strive to keep both bishops. The 2 bishops are referred to as the bishop pair. Bishops can also, most often with the queen, work in a battery. It is, however, possible, though rare at best, to have a battery with 2 bishops if a pawn were to be promoted to a bishop. The rook. The rook is your second most powerful piece after the queen. The rooks move any distance as long as they are unimpeded, either horizontally along the ranks or vertically along the files. Unimpeded, they always have 14 moves regardless of where they are, and therefore they're not influenced by any center. If they are blocked by one of their own pieces, they cannot go any further in that direction. If they can strike an opponent's piece, however, they may capture it, taking it off the board and occupying the square where their opponent's piece had been. Like the queen, the rooks tend to develop later in the game when the board has less pieces and movement is easier, and they work best on open or half-open files. The queen. The queen is by far your most powerful piece. She looms over the board, destroys her enemies as they run before her. She should be used from the very first possible move, brought out to rain devastation on your opponent. She's your ultimate weapon and should be used quickly to crush your opponent. Right? No. Over and over and over again during my chess career, I have taught beginners who believe this to be true. They saw the queen as a huge weapon and impatiently wanted to overwhelm their opponent. Not only will this fail countless times, you will almost certainly lose against a stronger, more experienced player just for trying such a tactic. Chess is a game of patience. While it is true that the queen possesses the greatest capabilities, matching those of both the rook and a bishop combined, she, like the rook, with only a few exceptions, really belongs at home early in the game. Plays that bring the queen out early tend to be rather low rated, novices at best, and do so simply because it's worked for them so often in the past. Probably the most successful use of this concept is with the scholar's mate, which will be taught in a later lesson. That does not mean the tactic is sound. It simply means their opponents were weaker chess players. As they grow and start to find stronger opponents, they will quickly learn how incorrect bringing their queen out into the fray early actually is. Like a rook, the queen moves far easier when the number of pieces on the board have been reduced and the pawn structure has been well established, allowing her more space for movement. A queen out early in the game tends to get trapped and very often lost. She also, despite being so powerful, tends to not work as well early in the game all by herself. Late in the game, she does become a powerful attacking and forking piece, totally on her own. But early on in the game, she really needs the others of her own army to support her efforts. With all that being said, let's review how the queen moves. As previously stated, the queen moves with the combined powers of both the rook and the bishop, allowing her to move in a straight line in any direction, horizontally, vertically, or diagonally, any distance, as long as she is unimpeded. If she can strike an opponent's piece, she may capture it. Like most of the pieces, she is influenced to a degree by a center. Her rook-like features are not affected at all by a center, but like a bishop, she has more moves when nearer the absolute center. She also can work in batteries with both the rooks and the bishops. The king. When I ask many new students which piece is the most important, a great many respond that the queen is, which is totally wrong. You can play the entire game without your queen. It ultimately is just another piece, albeit a powerful one. You lose the game, however, if your king is captured. After all, the goal of chess is to capture your opponent's king. It should be noted, though, that the king is never actually captured, since the game ends when he has no moves, is under attack, and can do nothing at all about it. Because of this, your king should stay at home early in the game, protected, shielded, and kept safe. The king, however, later in the game becomes a very strong attacker and defender in his own right. This usually does not occur, though, until most, if not all, of the major and minor pieces are off the board. Major pieces being defined as the queen and the rooks, and minor pieces are the knights and the bishops. So let's talk about the king's moves. The king, like the queen, can move in any direction. He, however, may only move one square at a time. The king, therefore, can move to any of these highlighted squares. The center of the board does have a small influence on the king, but the center of him is much larger. A king, anywhere within this square, has 8 possible moves. Outside of this square, it's reduced to 5 along the sides and to 3 in the corners. It is very important to note that a king can never come within one square of another king. To do so would be putting himself into check. Think of the 3 adjacent squares facing the other king as if it is a barrier, a wall, one that can be used often to mate your opponent. It is important to always be conscious of your king's safety, but do not be afraid of using him when the time is right.